Hi, this is Jane Meredith, and bringing you another interview from another essayist who is in Fio's and My Magic of the Pearl Pentacle, Alex Iantaffi, who has a beautiful, courageous, powerful essay in the Liberty section. Hi, Alex, welcome.
Hi, Jen Meredith. Thank you so much for this opportunity to talk about the wonderful book that you and Fia have put together. I mean, you've put together other wonderful books, but this is your latest offerings, and I love it. I'm so excited that I received it, and I'm just so excited to share it with all my community.
Great. So I'm going to ask you a few in-depth questions because, yeah, you're one of the contributors. I found your essay personally very powerful. As I said, it's in the Liberty section, and we'll get to that more in a moment. But first off, I want to ask what the Pearl Pentacle means to you, personally. Like, what's your personal relationship to this magical Pearl Pentacle?
I actually love the Pentacle magic. I'm both a reclaiming and a fairy initiate, and I find that generally the Pentacle tools are so powerful. And the power of Pearl is one of my favorites. So I'll just like say that bias straight up. Iron is very grounding and I love it. And I even love running the Elemental Pentacle because I'm a very energy running through my body kind of witch. And so for me, it's a way to run those energies through my body. But the beauty and the magic of Pearl Pentacle for me is that it's so connecting. For me, it's the magic of connection and the magic of kinship. It's kinship with the ecosystem, kinship with values that are really an integral part of my life, and kinship with my community. In a way, it's like, how do we put the layering of the elemental pentacle and the iron pentacle in practice in our relationships with one another in community? And so that's what I really love about the Pearl Pentacle personally. And it's a devotion to community in some way when I run the Pearl Pentacle. That's how it feels for me anyway.
Yeah, I love that devotion to community. I think it's also like a practice, like
Yes.
it's a verb really. Pearl Pentacle is a verb, to do, to be, and definitely involves others. And as I mentioned earlier, the particular essay that you've contributed is in the Liberty section. So I found your essay, I'm going to say fierce, accessible, and really I don't know, supportive and rousing, inspiring in terms of taking action and seeing the world differently, and believing that practically every word and action is a part potentially of liberation. So, yeah, I'd love you to speak a little into liberation and or liberty and what presence this has in your life. What part of your life you feel liberty is?
Oh, what a great and big question. So I'll do my best. And thank you for the beautiful words you said about my essay. I really appreciate them. I think, especially right now, right? I live in the so-called United States, right? And also there is the rise of fascism, even in my home country of Italy. So I've been thinking a lot about what does liberty mean in this moment of, kind of constriction and restriction on a collective level because of this global rise of fascism. And personally, I've been thinking a lot also about my privilege as an older queer person, an older witch in my mid 50s, and what is my role and what is my relationship to liberty in this moment. That's something that I've been sitting with quite a lot actually in the recent months and recent years. And I think for me, liberty is just there's something about um, collectivity in liberty is not just about that freedom, like individual freedom, freedom to be myself, right? Freedom to be liberty for me is about collective liberation, right? Until some of us are not free, none of us are free, right? As kind of organizers, and especially organizers of colors and Black organizers, teach us again and again. And so for me, when I think about liberty, I think about how I'm bound to literally the whole ecosystem, right? And to other humans. And how can I, with my actions, with my words, be part of that collective liberation? And I love that you said Pearl Pentacle is a verb. I'm like, yes. Like inside I was like, I mean, all magic is a verb for me, but Pearl Pentacle particularly, if we're just thinking about it or being, I can think about it, I can write about it, I can be lyrical about it, but if I'm not living it, then what am I doing, right? So for me, liberty is embodied, is relational, and it's about how do I walk in the world in a way that contributes not just to my freedom, but truly to the liberation of all beings, right? How am I really showing up in this kind of mycelium web as somebody who embodies liberation, and then that the work is both internal and external. I think that's one of the things that can be tricky about liberty, right? There's an internal process of liberation, and it's also external, and the two are not separate. There's a kind of a flow and a play between them, if that makes sense.
Yes, of course. It does make a lot of sense. Thank you. And in fact, my next question is about this internal liberation. Like one of my strongest moments, the first time I read your essay, and of course I have read it many, many, many times, but it stayed with me, this particular impression I had, where you wrote about how gender segregated spaces have not made us safe, have not ensured physical safety of, for example, myself, cis woman. And that just really resonated with me in a way that I was like, oh, like it had almost a vibratory quality. And I think it was such a an assumption, such an assumed plank so early on, that men have made women unsafe, and that to be safe, we need to segregate ourselves. And I mean, I, was a feminist in my 20s. I was an activist. And certainly, that was part of the thread of my understanding. So because I had that experience reading your essay, I'm really wondering about, like, do you have little tips or tricks of liberating one's own kind of mind and assumptions and almost history? Like, how do we do that to ourselves? How do we provoke ourselves or offer this liberation to ourselves from things that we're maybe not even questioning?
Oh, that is such a great and challenging question. And also thank you for like sharing a little bit about how my essay impacted you. I also came into feminism during the second wave of feminism. So there were a lot of women-only spaces. And that was one of the challenges actually early on in my own witchy journey, right? There were a lot of kind of Dianic gender segregated spaces. And even though I wasn't out as a transmasculine person at the time, there was some lack of like ease with those spaces that just didn't feel quite right for me. And I think a piece of that is that it just felt like we were just trying to protect ourselves. Sorry about that. Trying to protect ourselves by figuring out this is the threat, right? Men are the threat. So if we exclude men, then we're fine, right? But actually, what I knew in my bones for a lot of different reasons I'm not going into is that patriarchy is also upheld by women often. And the patriarchy goes in hand with like white supremacy. And so we cannot separate any of those things from one another. And so I think the main, I don't know if it's a tip or a trick, but the main way that I approach liberty, including from a gender perspective, is through my body, through like that somatic piece. For me, that if I am feeling like, oh, what is happening in my nervous system, right? If I'm feeling that constriction, I know that's information, right? It doesn't mean necessarily that I'm unsafe or that something is not okay. Like, okay, that this is information. What is happening here, right? And also, I've learned that I can feel constriction, not just because of what's happening in the present somatically, but also what happened in the past, right? And so for me, part of liberty is also being able to do that kind of work of healing, including the somatic work of healing that lets me put the past in the past so that when I approach people or situation, I can do my best to be grounded and open to what is now in the present. And even if there are things that kind of bring the past in or a trigger, I can approach them in a way where I can have a little bit more expansiveness, right? And I often say that for me as a witch, like our nervous system is such a magical tool. And so getting to know our nervous systems, getting to know where are places of constrictions and expansion, where are places where, like, do I know what safety feels like in my body? Because often we don't even know what safety feels like in our bodies. And then we enter into a space that's supposed to feel safe and we feel some sort of way, but we can't put like words to it quite yet. And but if we learn to trust our nervous system, there's so much wisdom, right? And that wisdom is not just our wisdom, sometimes it's also ancestral wisdom. And so I would say get to know your nervous system, know where you come from, and know what you've experienced and what you bring with you. And try to hold it with open hands when you come into a space so that you can connect with others in a more authentic and expansive way. And also letting go of perfectionism. Like, we're not going to do it perfectly. I've made many mistakes. I've used the wrong language, and I've learned a lot in community and in relationships. And I see when people give me feedback, I see it as a gift, right? Okay, does this make sense to me? If I'm not sure, can I check in with a trusted person? And then can I integrate what I've learned so that now that I know better, I can do better? I think it's Toni Morrison, right, that says that once we know better, we do better. I hope I got that quote correctly, but if not, I'm sorry. And so for me, it's kind of, there's just all of those things, the somatic piece, but also kind of holding things with open hands, including the feedback that others give us, and not get defensive or set in our ways, right? Um, and there's so much more to say about that, but I'm
No,
not going to
no.
do
I,
that right
I, I
now.
mean, yes, yes. I love that. I love that. And I
Mm,
particularly love it's what you're speaking there resonates with another piece that you wrote in your essay, which you said, like, we have to do it together. We have to
mhm.
do it with each other. Um, and that emphasis on, like, well, it's not just my somatic system. Like, I might have felt wonderful in those spaces, but it's actually me trusting your somatic system as well, and learning to be with those kind of multiple realities, I think, is some of the complexity of the work of liberation, which is leading me to my final question that I have for you,
Mhm.
Alex, which is that your beautiful essay is specifically about gender liberation. I'm going to ask you, and you mentioned before intersectionality. I'm going to ask you how you feel or understand gender liberation feeds into the narrative of liberation or other specific liberations.
Oh, absolutely. And I was like, I could write a book about this. I was like, oh, and God, I did. It's called Gender Trauma, and really in that book, and it's part of my belief, really, as I've engaged more and more deeply with this idea of gender my whole life in one way or another, um, real for me, that gender binary, that construction of the gender as a binary, it's very colonial, it's very rooted in Christian supremacy, is very rooted in colonial white values, is very rooted in whiteness, right? And it's not an accident, for example, that often when there are Olympics or other major sporting events, right, we've seen Black women athletes. Those are cisgender athletes, right? They're scrutinizing their gender because we cannot separate gender from how we're racialized as well, right? So really that rigid gender binary for me is a tool of colonialism, is a tool of the patriarchy, right? Is a tool of kind of white supremacy. And so when I'm working for gender liberation, I cannot work for gender liberation in isolation, right? It's also about Black liberation. It's also about, land back and decolonizing and really kind of looking at kind of where some of our values have come from and bringing that back to liberty, right? That like our liberation is connected. And similarly, kind of when we're policing our own gender or each other's gender, where is that policing coming from? And who benefits and who does it serve, right? And even if I look at kind of the history of the feminist movement, right? It's like, who does it serve to kind of even keep the interests of women separate, right? Like if we look even at the suffragettes would have much rather supported other white men rather than have black people vote, for example, in the so-called United States. And that's a painful piece of history for a lot of white women. I used to teach women's studies, but we cannot look away from the reality that the feminist movement, I've been a feminist since my teenage years and I'm in my 50s, has brought amazing gifts into my life. And also if I don't hear that there was a time in the UK, and I'm sure other places where lesbians were being excluded by the feminist movement, right? There's been a time, and there still is a time, where Black women's interests are often not aligned, with white women's interests because of that proximity to whiteness and power, right? If I'm not listening to trans folks, and especially trans feminine folks, about how trans misogyny operates, then am I really embracing womanhood in this larger concept, or does womanhood only mean certain things? And at the same time, if I'm demonizing masculinity and demonizing men, does that really serve our collective liberation? Because also often people have gestated and parented kind of boys and men into this world. And then what does it mean, right? And so for me, there is something about how all of our liberation is connected, and how when we exclude anybody from our liberatory path, it almost becomes like a constriction in that mycelium, right? In that web of life. And so for me, those things are connected and cannot be separated. And when we separate them, I think we do a disservice to liberty and to our community and ultimately to ourselves. I don't know if any of that made sense, but
It's really,
that's how I think about
it
it.
definitely made sense, Alex. And I like that, even though like the kind of gritty seriousness and the depth of this conversation and kind of the weeds that we're in discussing this, especially historically, but equally now, there's this strength coming through as well, which like the word solidarity came to mind early on, like and almost like a joyousness, I guess, in claiming liberation together beside others, kind of instead of at the expense of or ignoring others. So yeah, I want to really thank you for all that you brought into this essay and this book, and I hope everybody checks it out in the Liberty section in the Magic of the Pearl Pentacle. Thanks so much for your time, Alex. It's been delightful talking with you.
Oh, thank you so much, Jen Meredith. And thank you and Theo for bringing this beautiful book into the world.